So, today we are going to look at the Singleton, which is a design pattern, and basically what it means is we only want to have one instance of a class. So this is, I would say, probably an intermediate level lesson. We're going to use JavaScript as a programming language. If you're not familiar with JavaScript, then you should learn the fundamentals before learning design patterns in general. And it's also worth noting that JavaScript doesn't inherently give us the tools we need to implement a singleton design pattern. And the reason for that is JavaScript doesn't give us access modifiers. So the typical way that you would make a singleton class is you would give it a private constructor, and we can't do that natively in JavaScript. So instead, we're going to figure our own way to do it. So we need a use case first, and we need to understand what the pattern is and why we might want to use it. So all a singleton is a class where we only want one instance of it. So for whatever reason, we only want to have one instance of that class. Now, the most common scenario is database connections. So you might have something that creates connections to a database, and to avoid having lots of connections to the same database, you only want one instance of the class that does that. Another common scenario is logging. The same kind of thing, really. You only want one logger, typically, which you pass around your application. Now, there are concerns with using the singleton pattern. One of them is that it can violate the single responsibility principle, and the other one is that it's not thread safe if it's not implemented correctly. So if you were implementing this in something like C#, you would use a lazy of T to get around that, and that pretty much solves the problem. In JavaScript, we don't really have to worry about it anyway. So we're going to use JavaScript so that we can demonstrate this in a browser. I will put a link in the description to the repository that contains this. So when you go to the repository, you'll find various folders with different design patterns in. You can see there's a factory method game here, which there's a separate video about that one. And there'll be a folder just called Singleton, which you can look at and find this code. So it's just 3 files. We've just got an HTML file and a couple of references to some JavaScript. So first of all, let's have a look at this in the browser, and all we have on this page, as you probably saw here, is 2 buttons. And we're going to imagine that there's a scenario. Let me just reload this page. So we're going to imagine there's a scenario where we are making a video game and we have a super boss, and we only want to have one instance of that super boss. So this super boss crawls around the map, and you only ever want to have one of him because he's really hard to kill, right? So if you have client code which calls a function which creates that boss for the very first time, because he doesn't exist yet, then it should create the super boss. After that, if someone was to call the super boss again, create super boss, it would just return the same one. So for example, you have a super boss called Thor, and some other part of the code base tries to create another super boss with some different name. Well, the second time it's called, it's just going to give you Thor, the initial super boss, because you can only have one of them. And that's essentially what the singleton pattern is. It's a way to force the same class to be returned after it's been instantiated for the first time. So to make this a bit more clear, I will demonstrate now. So we have 2 buttons here on our page, and one of them implements the singleton pattern in the correct way, which is the create singleton. And the other one is just called create superboss, and the button says create global variable on here, and you'll soon see why. So let's first test it. So we have our create global variable. So this is going to create us a superboss. So let's call him, we said Thor, didn't we? So let's call him Thor. And you can see in the console here, it's created a new boss with the name Thor. Okay, that's great. Now let's say that we have some other part of the code which does the same thing. So we click create global variable, and let's this time give the boss a name of Mick. And hopefully now you can see the problem. We said we only ever wanted one super boss, and we've now got one called Thor and one called Mick. And if we had another one called Y, we'd get the same thing. So you can see it's just creating a new instance every time. So let's look at the code that does that and why it's happening. So on click for this create global variable calls create superboss, which is in this file here, the no singleton problem example. So what's happening? Here's our function, create superboss. We're being prompted for the name, and we're storing that in a variable. And then all we're doing is we're storing the superboss variable in the global window, and we are creating a new superboss. So we have a class here, and we pass in a name, and you can see it sets the name, and then it logs the name to the console. So the problem here, and the reason this is happening, should be fairly obvious. We're storing the superboss in the window, which is a way of storing it as a single variable. So the very first time this is called, you could say it's a singleton. There's only one instance of the superboss, and it's stored in a variable in the global window object. The problem is, as soon as you call it again, it overrides the existing one. So we're not creating a new global variable each time. It's every time it's using the window.superboss, but it's going to be logging or creating a new instance of the class each time and putting that against the variable. That's not what we want. We want to have the same thing every time. So if we go back to our browser window, and let's just clear the console here. And that's not how you do it in Firefox, so let's just refresh the page. So we will click our create singleton this time, and this should do it the correct way. So let's call him Thor again. And we can see we've got a new boss created with the name Thor. Now, if we call some other code, which does the same thing, let's this time call him Rude. Only one super boss can exist. The name is Thor. Okay, well, let's try it again. Let's try creating one called Y. And we can see we've got two logs that are exactly the same now. So this is telling us we had Thor the first time and we're going to get him every subsequent time. Why is that happening? So if we go back to our button here, you can see this time it's calling a function called create singleton. So if we go into our singleton here, we've got a function create singleton. It does the same thing, it prompts us and it gets the name. And this time it does the exact same thing, window.superboss, but we have a very different implementation this time. So this is I will preface this by saying this is a hack in JavaScript because, as I said, it doesn't offer a native way of having private constructors. So this implementation will achieve the same thing, and I've put a note on here basically giving you ways of doing it in other languages. So in .NET, C#, you could actually declare the constructor as private. So anyway, we'll see how this is working. So we have a const called singleton, and this has a private property on it called instance and a private class called singleton class. Now, the instance is very important because this is where we're going to store our superboss. And it's only going to let us do that once. So let's kind of go through the flow and hopefully you can see what's happening here. So when we click create singleton, it hits this function, create singleton, and then it calls singleton.create superboss. So that, as you can see here, this is the only public method on this class because it's within this return statement here. So we pass in a name to create superboss, which is the one that we were prompted for. And if there's an instance or if there's not an instance already, then it's going to give us a new singleton class. Now, if you think about it, the very first time you call this create superboss, there won't be an instance because remember up here, instance is a private property and it's not been set yet. So it's going to be undefined. So because this is undefined, it's going to hit this block of code. So instance is a new singleton class and we pass in the name. Well, what does that do? Well, hopefully you can recognize this. This singleton class here is doing the exact same thing our superboss was. Setting a name, this.name equals name, and it has a console log, which says new boss created with the name. So that's exactly the same. So the very first time that's what happens. So let's just verify that again. So we create our singleton, we call him Thor, and new boss created with the name Thor, we've hit this line of code here. So what happens if we hit this code again? Well, we click our button, create singleton, we create the singleton, which gives us this prompt, and window.superboss equals, and we hit the same thing, singleton.create superboss. So this time, this code block won't be hit because if you remember, our instance, which we set down here the very first time, has now been set, and it's been set to a new singleton class. So this Singleton class that we created the first time is now our instance property. So when we say if there is no instance, well, that's not true anymore. So this piece of code will not be hit. So what it's doing instead is it's logging us to tell us only one superboss can exist and their name is, and it's giving us the instance. Remember again, that's the Singleton class here, or you could call this the superboss name, and it's returning instance. So it's returning the very first instance that we came across. And that's why if we click it again and we press Y or anything else, it's going to hit that second piece of code and tell us that the name already exists. So let's put a debugger here. Okay, great. So we've hit our debugger. This should make things a bit more obvious for you. I'm going to skip over it the first time because we haven't clicked anything. So we're going to create Singleton. And we're going to call him Billy this time. And you can see new boss created with the name Billy. Okay, great. That's what we wanted. Now, this time, and then I'll tell you what I will do. I'll actually put a debugger here as well. Okay. So, create superboss. Now the name is Billy, so that's what we passed through. And if we step over this, instance is undefined. So remember, this is the very first time we're creating this, so the instance is not defined. So what we're going to do is get into this piece of code here. An instance is going to become a new Singleton class. And again, think of this as the superboss. That's essentially what this is. So we'll skip over this, and we're going to return that instance. Now, if you were actually consuming this in a real application, you would now have access to that object that was returned. So we'll click play, we'll go back to our console, and we can say new boss created with the name Billy. So if we click again, and this time we do try to create Thor, what's going to happen? So we can see here we've got a name of Thor that's being passed through. However, our instance is now an object with the name Billy, because remember the first time we went around, it was created here. So instance is Billy. So when we check this piece of code and we say if there is no instance, well, that's not going to be hit because there is an instance this time. Remember, this piece of code just means is the variable undefined, which is not. And so instead, we're going to log this, and more importantly, we're going to return instance. So if you look at the object that's returned here, it's Billy is the first boss we created, which is why we are told there's only one superboss and the name is Billy. So that's the Singleton pattern. Hopefully it's clear to you. If you can understand it in this context, in this JavaScript implementation we've used here, you'll be able to understand it even easier in an object-oriented language like C# or Java, because it's much easier to implement. So this is kind of doing it in hard mode. If you can understand this one, you've pretty much got it. The use case, again, is you only want one instance of a class. The downsides to this are it can violate the single responsibility principle, which we talked about earlier, and also singletons can be hard to mock in unit tests and that kind of thing, so you do have to be mindful of it and check it's the right scenario for you and that you need to use it in your application. But if you do, this is an implementation of it. I will put a link to the GitHub repository and you'll be able to have access to all these 3 files and have a play with it yourself.